I'm about to tell you about a town that shouldn't exist. In 2010, a census worker named David Chen drove 7 hours into the Montana wilderness to count residents of Havenwood, a mining town that existed only on territorial maps and forgotten Forest Service records. He expected maybe 100 people, bad coffee, and paperwork that smelled like wood smoke. What he found was a biological impossibility that had been hiding in plain sight for 163 years. The average adult height was 6 feet 7 inches. The door frames in the general store were built at 8 feet. The high school basketball hoops hung at 11 feet because regulation height made the game meaningless. 3 residents measured over 7 foot 2. Not basketball recruits bust in from cities. Born there. Raised there, their parents born there, their grandparents born there. Chen flagged it, called his supervisor, said the numbers didn't make sense. His supervisor told him to double-check his measurements and stop wasting time. But a University of Montana geneticist named Dr. Eris Thorne saw his report. She recognized what Chen couldn't. This wasn't a statistical anomaly or data entry error. This was a founder effect taken to an extreme that shouldn't occur naturally. She assembled a research team, drove to Havenwood, convinced the younger residents to submit blood samples. What she found in their DNA made her hands shake. 87% of the town's 340 residents carried an identical genetic marker that existed nowhere in the human genome database. Not a mutation, not a variation. Something completely unknown to science. When she traced the genealogical records backward through church registries, land deeds, and family Bibles, every single bloodline converged on one woman, Sarah Mackenzie, who appeared in the mining camp in 1847, pregnant, alone, wearing animal hides, speaking broken English. A woman the prospectors' journals described as having unnatural strength, and eyes that reflected light like a wolf's. Dr. Thorne ran the Mackenzie marker against a classified database of anomalous primate samples recovered from Bigfoot sighting locations. Samples the government collected but never admitted existed. The match came back at 40%. Sarah Mackenzie wasn't human, not entirely. She was a hybrid. And she founded the largest concentrated Bigfoot human bloodline in North America, an entire community that lived for over 160 years without knowing what they were. This is that story. David Chen had been a census worker for 6 years. He'd counted residents in trailer parks where people gave fake names, nursing homes where half the beds were empty but still billed to Medicare, and compounds where men with rifles met him at the gate. None of it prepared him for Havenwood. The town sat in a valley 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a logging route that required a Forest Service permit and a vehicle with clearance high, enough to straddle the drainage ruts. The GPS lost signal 20 minutes in. Chen followed hand-painted signs nailed to trees. Havenwood, 15 miles. Havenwood, 8 miles. Private town. Respect posted rules. He arrived just after noon on a Tuesday in March 2010. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No highway hum, no aircraft, just wind through pine and the distant sound of machinery. A sawmill maybe, or a mine shaft ventilator. The second thing he noticed was the size of everything. The general store had a porch roof that sat 9 feet off the ground. The post office door was a solid 8 feet tall. The gas pump, an ancient analog model that looked like it belonged in a museum, had a handle positioned higher than Chen's shoulder. He was 5'9", not tall, but not unusually short. He'd never felt small before. He parked in front of the general store. A woman stepped onto the porch. She smiled, waved. Chen got out of his car and looked up. She was at least 6'4", maybe taller. Broad-shouldered, dressed in Carhartt work pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. arms that looked like they could split firewood for hours without rest. Her handshake was careful, controlled, like she'd learned early how much strength to hold back. "You must be the census man," she said. "I'm Evelyn Driscoll, mayor, for what that's worth out here." Chen introduced himself, asked where he could find the administrative records, births, deaths, property deeds, anything that would give him a resident count. Evelyn laughed. "We keep it simple. Come on inside. I'll get you the binder." The interior of the general store was a combination: post office, town hall, and supply depot. Shelves stocked with canned goods, work gloves, ammunition, motor oil, a wood stove in the corner, a bulletin board covered in handwritten notices, venison for sale, chimney cleaning services, a reminder about the spring community potluck. Evelyn pulled a 3-ring binder from behind the counter, flipped it open. Neat rows of names, birth dates, addresses. No street names, just descriptions. Mackenzie Homestead, north end of Valley. Tate Cabin, East Ridge above the mill. Carver Property, Old Mine Road. Chen started copying names, counting. Halfway down the second page, he paused. "These heights," he said. "Are they accurate?" Evelyn glanced over his shoulder. "Far as I know, Doc Mercer measures everyone at their yearly checkups. Why?" "Your average adult height is 6'7". She shrugged. "Sounds about right. That's 9 inches above the U.S. male average. We eat a lot of elk." Chen stared at her. "I'm serious," Evelyn said. "Wild game, clean water, hard work. Builds strong bones. My granddad used to say we're what people would look like if they didn't spend their lives sitting in cars and eating garbage." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of thing that made sense if you didn't think too hard. But Chen had been trained to notice patterns, and this wasn't just a cluster of tall families. This was an entire town. He finished copying the records. 340 residents, 82 family units. Average male height, 6'8". Average female height, 6'3". 12 individuals over 7 feet tall. He asked to meet Dr. Mercer. The clinic was a renovated house at the edge of town. One examination room, a small office. Shelves of medical supplies that looked like they were ordered in bulk from veterinary catalogs. Dr. Mercer was 73, born in Havenwood, trained at a state school in the 1960s, and returned to practice in his hometown because somebody had to. He was 6'10". "You're here about the height thing," Mercer said, before Chen could introduce himself. "Is it a concern?" "Not medically. No joint problems. No cardiovascular abnormalities. Bone density is actually above average. I've been documenting it for 40 years. Sent reports to the state health department twice. Never heard back." "What do you think causes it?" Mercer leaned back in his chair. It creaked. "Founder effect. You know what that is?" Chen nodded. "Small population, limited gene pool. Certain traits become dominant." "Exactly. Havenwood was settled by maybe 30 families in the 1850s. Isolated location, difficult travel, people married locally. You get genetic bottlenecking. Traits that might be rare elsewhere become common. It's not unique. There are villages in Sardinia where everyone has a specific blood disorder. Towns in Appalachia with 6-fingered families. We just happen to be tall." It was the same explanation Evelyn gave. Clean, logical, supported by real science. Chen thanked him, drove back to the motel in the nearest town with cell service, filed his report, flagged the height data as a statistical anomaly worth reviewing. His supervisor called 2 days later, told him to recheck his measurements. Chen said he'd triple-checked. His supervisor said it was probably a data entry error and closed the case, but the report stayed in the system. And 3 months later, Dr. Eris Thorne, a population geneticist at the University of Montana, ran a data sweep looking for isolated communities with unusual hereditary patterns. Havenwood was the first result. She read Chen's report 4 times, pulled up satellite images of the town, checked historical census records. The population had been stable for a century, never growing much, never shrinking much, always hovering around 300 people. She called Chen, asked if he'd be willing to put her in touch with the town leadership. He gave her Evelyn Driscoll's satellite phone number. Dr. Thorne made the call, introduced herself, explained that she studied founder populations and would like to visit Havenwood to document their unique genetic heritage. Evelyn was silent for a long time. "We're not interested in being studied," she finally said. "I understand, but this could be significant. Your community represents a remarkable example of, we know what we are. We don't need outsiders telling us." The line went dead. Dr. Thorne sat in her office, staring at the dropped call on her phone. She'd expected resistance. Isolated communities were often suspicious of academics. But there was something in Evelyn's voice, not defensiveness, not hostility, fear. She scheduled a trip to Havenwood anyway, because in her 15 years of studying human population genetics, she'd never seen a pattern like this. And if the town's explanation was correct, if it really was just a founder effect and good nutrition, then it would be a textbook case worth publishing. But if it wasn't, if there was something else in their blood, something the town didn't understand or didn't want to name, then Dr. Eris Thorne was about to make the most important discovery of her career. She just didn't know yet that it would be a discovery she could never share. David Chen's census report sat in a queue for 3 weeks before it landed on the right desk. Dr. Eris Thorne was working through her morning coffee in the University of Montana's genetics lab when a colleague forwarded her the flagged file. She read it twice. Average adult height, 6 feet 7 inches. 87 residents between 6 feet 4 inches and 7 feet 3 inches. Isolated population. No clear explanation. She recognized it immediately. A textbook founder effect, where a small founding population's genetic traits become amplified through generations of isolation. Iceland had it. Remote Appalachian communities had it. But those populations showed increased rates of specific diseases or recessive traits. Height on this scale, maintained across multiple generations without apparent health complications, was different. She assembled a small team, 2 graduate students, a phlebotomist, and enough equipment to run comprehensive genetic panels. They made the drive to Havenwood on a Tuesday in September, following the same logging roads Chen had described, watching the cell's signal die 2 hours before they reached the town. The locals weren't hostile. They were polite in the way people are when they want you to leave. Dr. Thorne set up in the community center, a cavernous building with 12-foot ceilings and reinforced floors, and waited. A few townspeople came by out of curiosity, stood in the doorway, asked questions about what the tests would show. None volunteered. The town's doctor, a woman named Helen Cross, who stood 6 feet 9 inches herself, stopped by on the 3rd day. She'd practiced in Havenwood for 40 years. She listened to Dr. Thorne's explanation of genetic markers and population studies. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. "These people don't trust outsiders," Dr. Cross said, "and they don't think they need fixing." "I'm not here to fix anyone," Dr. Thorne said. "I'm here to understand." Same thing to them. But Dr. Cross left a stack of medical records from the past 4 decades, anonymous. Patients identified only by year of birth and family line. The data showed patterns. Bone density measurements far above human norms, like resting heart rates in the low 40s. Visual acuity tests that suggested enhanced night vision. One notation appeared in over 60 files. Patient reports unusual heat tolerance and minimal perspiration, even during extreme exertion. These weren't variations on normal human physiology. They were systematic differences. The breakthrough came from the younger residents. A woman named Claire Mackenzie, 26, who'd spent 2 years at a college in Missoula before coming back, walked into the community center on the 5th day with 7 friends. They'd grown up hearing they were special, that their families had mountain blood. They wanted to know what that actually meant. Claire rolled up her sleeve first. Dr. Thorne drew samples from 18 volunteers that week. She ran initial panels in the mobile lab setup, then couriered the samples to the university for comprehensive sequencing. The results came back in stages. First, confirmation of what was visible. Genetic markers associated with height, bone density, muscle fiber composition. Then the ancestry panels, which showed exactly what she'd expected. A massive founder effect. Mitochondrial DNA traced through maternal lines showed remarkable uniformity. These people were related, descendants of a very small founding population. Then she saw the anomaly. It appeared in the 3rd round of analysis, buried in a section of chromosome 7. A marker, complex, functional, approximately 40,000 base pairs, that appeared in identical form in 87% of the samples. Not similar, identical. She ran it against every database she had access to. Human Genome Project archives, International HapMap, 1,000 genomes, ancient DNA samples from Neanderthal and Denisovan specimens. Nothing. She sat in her office at 2 a.m., staring at the sequence on her screen. If they say wasn't junk DNA, the complexity suggested active coding. It wasn't a recent mutation. The identical replication across dozens of individuals meant it had been inherited, stable, for generations. It was something that didn't exist in any recorded human population on Earth. She called it MKZ1847. Mackenzie, after the most common surname in the samples. 1847, after the earliest church records she'd found in the town archives. When she returned to Havenwood 2 weeks later, she didn't bring the graduate students. She came alone, carrying a laptop and a genealogy report that had taken 3 researchers 100 hours to compile. She met with Claire and 6 of the other volunteers in a back room of the town's only bar, a place called the Mine Shaft with door frames that cleared 8 feet. "You were right," Dr. Thorne said. "You are different. All of you share a genetic marker I've never seen before. It's not in any database. It's not a known mutation." Claire leaned forward. "What is it?" "I don't know yet, but I know where it came from." She opened the laptop and turned it to face them. The screen showed a family tree, branches spreading across multiple pages, all converging on a single point at the top. Every person we tested traces back to the same maternal ancestor. Her name was Sarah Mackenzie. She appears in the town records for the first time in 1847, already pregnant. Before that, there's nothing. No birth record, no immigration papers, no family history. She just appeared. One of the men at the table, a logger named Marcus, shook his head. "That's impossible. Everybody's got a birth record, even back then." "Not on the frontier," Dr. Thorne said. "People came from nowhere all the time, but Sarah wasn't just anyone. The church records describe her as a woman of unusual stature and strength. The mining camp logs mention her 14 times in 2 years. More than any other individual. She worked claims, carried ore, built structures. She gave birth to 7 children between 1847 and 1862, and all of them survived to adulthood." She pulled up another document. Historical infant mortality in frontier settlements was over 30%. Sarah lost none, and all 7 of her children were noted in various records for their exceptional size. Her oldest son, Thomas, was measured at his death in 1891. He was 7 feet, 2 inches tall, The room was quiet. Your entire town, Dr. Thorne said, is descended from a woman who appeared out of the Montana wilderness 160 years ago carrying something in her DNA that has never been seen in any other human population. That marker is the reason you're all tall, the reason you have the bone density and heart rates you do. It's the reason your community has produced champion loggers, wildfire fighters, and high-altitude rescue workers for 6 generations. Claire's voice was careful. What are you saying? That she wasn't human? Dr. Thorne closed the laptop. I'm saying I need more samples, and I need access to historical remains, if any exist. Because whatever Sarah Mackenzie was, she's the key to understanding all of you. The Havenwood Cemetery sat on a hillside north of town, graves marked by stones that ranged from rough-cut granite to modern polished markers. Dr. Thorne walked it with Claire and the town's unofficial historian, an 81-year-old man named Ben Carver who knew every burial plot by heart. Sarah Mackenzie's grave was near the old section, beneath a ponderosa pine that had been a sapling when she died. The stone was simple. Sarah Mackenzie, 1820 to 1889, mother of Havenwood. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers at its base within the past week. We'd need permission from the descendants to exhume, Dr. Thorne said. That's the entire town. You're not digging up Sarah, Ben said flatly, but you don't need to. He led them to a newer section where a marker read, Thomas Mackenzie, 1847 to 1891, Sarah's firstborn. Thomas's great-great-grandson is the mayor, Ben said. He might say yes. Thomas was a legend. Folks wouldn't mind him helping science. It took 2 weeks to get the permits. The exhumation was quiet, done at dawn with only essential personnel present. The casket had deteriorated, but the skeleton inside was intact and massive. The long bones measured consistent with a living height of 7 feet, 2 inches, exactly as recorded. The bone density was so extreme it had delayed decomposition. Dr. Thorne extracted samples from the femur and 3 teeth. She shipped them to a lab specializing in ancient DNA extraction, paying for expedited processing out of her own grant budget. While she waited, she worked through the paper trail. Church records from 1847 describe Sarah's arrival in fragmented entries. A woman came to the camp this week, alone and with child. She speaks little English. Pastor Whitmore gave her shelter. Another entry 3 months later. The Mackenzie woman delivered a son. The child is healthy and of remarkable size. She refuses baptism, but allowed the child to be blessed. Land deeds showed Sarah claimed a mining plot in 1848, working it herself until 1851 when she sold it and purchased farmland in the valley. Tax records listed her as head of household for 41 years. She never remarried. She never listed a father for any of her 7 children. Dr. Thorne found a prospector's journal in the Montana Historical Society archives, written by a man named Samuel Drake who passed through the mining camp in 1849. His entry for June 14th read, "Met the tall woman today. They call her Sarah. She carried a full ore cart up from the lower claim without assistance, a feat that would challenge 3 men. Her eyes reflect light like an animal's. The other miners fear her but need her strength. She speaks rarely and watches everything. I do not think she is entirely civilized." Another entry from a missionary's report in 1852. "The Mackenzie children are a curiosity. All are unusually large and robust, silent like their mother, and possessed of an unsettling awareness. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 3 years, tracked a deer through the woods with no training. The mother will not say where she learned to survive alone, nor why she came to this place. The native tribes in the region have stories of wild people in the high mountains, giants who live beyond the snow line. When I asked if Sarah might be of their people, they said only that she is something else. The DNA results from Thomas Mackenzie's remains arrived on a Thursday. Dr. Thorne read them 3 times before calling her department chair. "The marker is in Thomas's DNA," she said. "MKZ-1847, identical to the living population. It's confirmed hereditary through the maternal line, but that's not the significant finding." "What is?" "Thomas's genome shows the marker at approximately 20% saturation. The living descendants show it at 8 to 12%, depending on generation. It's diluting, exactly as you'd expect with each successive outcross to non-carrier lines. Which means the source had it at higher concentration. Sarah had it at approximately 40%, Dr. Thorne said. That's not a mutation. That's hybridization. The word hung in the air. Hybridization with what? Dr. Thorne pulled up the sequence on her screen, the 40,000 base pairs that existed nowhere in the known human genome. I don't know, but I need to find out. She spent 3 days composing the request. Then she sent a carefully worded email to a contact at the NIH who specialized in genetic anomalies. She didn't mention Bigfoot. She didn't mention cryptids. She asked only if there were any classified databases of unidentified primate DNA samples, hair, tissue, blood, collected from sources outside standard research channels. The response came back in 6 hours. Call me. Don't email again. They spoke for 40 minutes. Her contact, a researcher named Dr. Paul Hendricks, explained that there was a database, technically maintained by the Department of Interior, that cataloged biological samples recovered from anomalous wildlife encounter sites. It had been assembled quietly over 6 decades from Forest Service reports, game warden collections, and samples submitted by private individuals following sightings of unidentified large primates. The database was not classified, but it was not publicized. It contained approximately 3,400 samples. 90% were identified as bear, elk, or human contaminants. The remaining 10% were listed as unresolved primate, species unknown. You need clearance to access it, Dr. Hendricks said, and you need a reason that doesn't sound insane. Dr. Thorne submitted the request through official university channels, framing it as research into isolated human populations with potential archaic hominin admixture, similar to Neanderthal and Denisovan studies. She included her data on the Mackenzie marker, the genealogical evidence, and the historical records of Sarah's appearance from the wilderness. Approval came back in 3 weeks. She accessed the database on a Friday evening, alone in her lab. She uploaded the MKZ-1847 sequence and ran the comparison algorithm against all 340 unresolved samples. The program took 40 minutes to process. When the results appeared, her hands went still on the keyboard. The Mackenzie marker matched 193 samples with 78 to 82% genetic similarity. The samples came from locations across the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, and Western Canada. All were hair or tissue. All were collected between 1967 and 2009 from sites associated with reported Sasquatch encounters. The match wasn't exact. The marker in the database samples was more complete, more concentrated, closer to the source. Sarah Mackenzie's DNA showed a 40% integration of this non-human sequence. The database samples showed 95 to 98%. Dr. Thorne sat in the empty lab, the screen's glow, the only light, and understood what she was looking at. Sarah Mackenzie had been a hybrid, first generation. Her father or mother, one of her biological parents, had been the creature that people spent lifetimes searching for in the woods, and she had walked into a Montana mining camp in 1847, pregnant and alone, and founded a bloodline that still lived today. The prospectors' journals from 1847 read like something out of a fever dream. January 14th. A woman appeared at the camp perimeter this morning. She came from the North Ridge. Impossible in this snow, we all agreed. No tracks we could follow back. She wore hides we didn't recognize, stitched with sinew in patterns none of the trappers knew. Her English was broken, barely functional, asked for shelter. We couldn't refuse. Leaving anyone out in this cold is murder. But the men are uneasy. There's something about her that doesn't sit right. Dr. Thorne read the digitized pages in the Montana Historical Society archives. Her research assistant Maya scrolling through document after document. The journals had been donated by the Havenwood Mining Company's descendants in 1963, part of a tax write-off. No one had paid much attention to them until now, January 19th. The woman, she says her name is Sarah, though she struggles with the pronunciation, lifted a full ore cart today. Lifted it. 2 men usually drag those. She did it alone, repositioned it near the smelter like it was a wheelbarrow. The foreman told her to stop, said it was making the men uncomfortable. She didn't seem to understand why. The entries continued for weeks. Sarah Mackenzie. She took the surname from a prospector who'd befriended her. A Scotsman named Duncan Mackenzie, who felt protective of the strange woman, refused to speak about where she'd come from. When pressed, she gestured vaguely toward the mountains and said, "High up," in her halting English. When asked about her family, she touched her belly. She was visibly pregnant when she arrived. February 3rd. Duncan says Sarah's been here a month now. She's adapted, learned more English, started wearing proper clothes, though she still goes barefoot even in snow. Her feet don't seem to feel cold. I watched her walk across the frozen creek yesterday without flinching. The ice didn't even crack under her weight, and she must be close to 7 feet tall. I've never seen a woman so large. The men have stopped joking about it. There's something in her eyes when she looks at you, not hostile exactly. Wary, like she's deciding whether you're a threat. Dr. Thorne leaned back in her chair. Pull up the physical descriptions, every entry that mentions what she looked like. Maya created a filtered document. 23 separate entries, spanning from January 1847 to Sarah's death in December 1891, all describing the same unsettling details. Unusually tall, estimates ranged from 6'8" to 7'2". Difficult to measure exactly because Sarah refused to be formally measured. Hands described as massive, oversized, like a man's but longer. Facial features noted as strong, broad, handsome but not delicate, with a prominent brow. Eyes that caught lamplight strangely and reflected like an animal's when you surprised her at night. Shoulders broader than most men, and a thick muscular build unusual for a woman, even a large one. Feet that multiple sources called disproportionately large, and ape-like in their width. Hair that was coarse, dark, and grew thick. She cut it with a knife because no scissors in camp could manage it. Jesus, Maya whispered. They're describing... Don't say it yet. Dr. Thorne clicked through to another archive. Territorial records from the Montana Historical Society's indigenous collections. Let's see what the Salish and Kootenai tribes said about the area. The search took an hour, but the results were immediate. A Salish elder interviewed in 1923 spoke about the stick people of the high ranges, tall, hair-covered beings who avoided humans, but occasionally took women from villages, or left children at village borders. The interviewer had dismissed it as folklore. The recording had been filed under mythology/cautionary tales. A Kootenai oral history from 1889 mentioned a woman who'd lived with the forest giants for a winter and returned pregnant, only to be exiled by her tribe for carrying something unclean. The history didn't name her, but it placed the event 2 generations ago, roughly the 1840s. Dr. Thorne's hands were shaking. She clasped them together. Cross-reference the dates. If Sarah appeared in January 1847 and gave birth in May 1847, she was already 7 or 8 months pregnant when she arrived. Work backward. Conception would have been around September or October 1846. She pulled up topographical maps of the region. The tribal records mention high ranges. The prospectors said she came from the North Ridge. That's Cabinet Mountains wilderness, some of the most remote terrain in North America even today. In 1846, it was completely unsettled. Maya was already searching. There's a Kootenai story about a woman who went missing in August 1846 while gathering berries in the high meadows. She was found 6 weeks later, alive but refusing to speak. The tribe said she'd been touched by the forest and cast her out within a month. She looked up. If that's Sarah, then she was taken by something, impregnated by something, and returned. Dr. Thorne pulled up the genetic data on a second screen, and whatever it wasn't human. The prospector's journals confirmed Sarah gave birth to her first child, a son, in May 1847. She delivered alone in a supply shed, refusing the camp's only midwife. When Duncan Mackenzie found her the next morning, she was nursing a baby boy who, even at birth, was noted as unusually large, 10 or 11 pounds if he's an ounce. She named him Thomas. Over the next 15 years, Sarah gave birth to 6 more children, 3 more sons and 3 daughters. All survived infancy, a statistical miracle in the 1840s Montana Territory where child mortality hovered near 40%. All grew to extraordinary size. The records from Havenwood's small church, kept by a circuit preacher who visited monthly, documented their growth. Thomas Mackenzie, 6 feet 9 inches by age 16. Samuel Mackenzie, 6 feet 11 inches by age 17. James Mackenzie, 7 feet 3 inches by age 19, the tallest man anyone in the territory had ever seen. Catherine Mackenzie, 6 feet 4 inches by age 15. Margaret Mackenzie, 6 feet 7 inches by age 16. Ruth Mackenzie, 6 feet 10 inches by age 17, described as a giantess in the church record. The 7th child, a daughter named Grace, died at age 12 from pneumonia, but even she had been nearly 6 feet tall when she passed. They called them the Giants of Havenwood, Maya said, reading from a local history pamphlet published in 1952. It was a point of pride. The town's founders, bigger, stronger, tougher than anyone else in Montana. There are stories about Thomas Mackenzie wrestling a black bear that wandered into camp. Samuel Mackenzie once carried an injured miner 8 miles through snow to the doctor. James Mackenzie worked as a logger and could drop trees faster than 3-man teams. Dr. Thorne pulled up a photograph from 1889, one of the earliest in Havenwood's collection. It showed the town's mining leadership. 15 men standing in front of the company office. 7 of them towered over the others, a foot or more taller, their frames broad and powerful. All 7 were Sarah's sons or grandsons. By 1900, Maya continued, reading census records, 60% of Havenwood's population was directly descended from Sarah Mackenzie. By 1920, it was 81%. By 1950, 92%. Today, it's 97%. Dr. Thorne stared at the genetic readout again. 87% of current residents carrying the MKZ1847 marker. She didn't just start a family line, Dr. Thorne said quietly. She became the town. Every wedding, every birth, every generation folded her DNA deeper into the population. And no one ever questioned why everyone kept getting taller. Maya scrolled back to the earliest journal entry, the one from January 14th, 1847. "There's something about her that doesn't sit right," she read aloud. Dr. Thorne closed the file. They had no idea. By 1865, Havenwood had stopped being a mining camp and started being a town. And the Mackenzie family had stopped being curiosities and started being infrastructure. Thomas Mackenzie, Sarah's firstborn, ran the largest independent mining operation outside the company claims. His crew, mostly his brothers and cousins, pulled more ore in a week than standard teams managed in a month. Foremen who'd initially dismissed them as freaks learned quickly. The Mackenzies didn't tire. They worked 10-hour shifts in the deep shafts without complaint, hauled loads that broke other men's backs, and emerged each evening barely winded. Samuel Mackenzie became the town's de facto security after he single-handedly stopped a claim dispute from turning into a shootout. He'd walked into the center of 15 armed men, taken the guns from the 2 ringleaders before anyone could react, and told them all to go home. They did. No one argued with a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and could palm your skull like a melon. James Mackenzie, the giant of giants at 7 feet 3 inches, turned to logging when the mines started playing out in the 1870s. Timber companies paid premium wages for his crews because they delivered results no one else could match. There's a company photograph from 1881 showing James standing beside a felled Douglas fir, his axe resting on his shoulder. The tree's diameter is 8 feet. James is smiling slightly. His hand resting on the bark looks inhuman. Fingers too long, palm too broad, proportions subtly wrong in ways the photograph almost captures. Dr. Thorne had the image analyzed by a forensic anthropologist. "Those aren't pathological," the report concluded. "No signs of gigantism, acromegaly, or Marfan syndrome, the usual culprits for extreme height. The skeletal structure is proportional, just scaled up, and the hands..." The anthropologist had paused on the recorded Zoom call. "The metacarpal length ratio is outside normal human range, closer to what you'd see in great apes. I don't know what to make of that." Dr. Thorne did. The sisters were just as formidable, though their legend took different shapes. Catherine Mackenzie married a prospector named William Cross and ran the town's general store. Records show she did all the heavy lifting herself, hauling 100-pound flour sacks and repositioning iron stoves without help. Margaret Mackenzie never married, but became the town's midwife and informal doctor. Her size apparently made difficult births easier because she could physically manipulate a mother's position or apply traction no smaller woman could manage. Ruth Mackenzie, the tallest daughter, left Havenwood in 1869 to work as a scout for a railroad survey crew. She spent 3 years in the wilderness, returned with enough money to buy land, and built her own homestead alone. The cabin still stands, its doorways built for someone nearly 7 feet tall. By 1880, the Mackenzie name appeared on every significant deed, business license, and church record in Havenwood. They weren't just a large family. They were the economic and social center of gravity. Other families either married into the line or existed in its orbit. And the children kept growing. Dr. Thorne's genealogical reconstruction team, 2 researchers from the University of Montana, and a contracted genealogist who specialized in isolated populations, built the family tree using church baptismal records, territorial marriage licenses, mining company payroll logs, and a century of census data. The pattern was undeniable. Every generation, taller, stronger, more of them. Thomas's 6 children averaged 6 feet 6 inches. Samuel's 8 children averaged 6 feet 8 inches. James's 12 children, he'd married twice after his first wife died in childbirth, averaged 6 feet 10 inches, with his youngest son cresting 7 feet 1 inch by age 20. Genetic amplification, Dr. Thorne explained to the team during a working session in her university lab. She projected the family tree onto the wall, a sprawling diagram that looked more like a root system than a genealogy. When Sarah's children married non-Mackenzies, people who'd migrated to Havenwood from other territories, the hybrid vigor should have diluted. Heights should have regressed to the mean over 2 or 3 generations. But they didn't, Maya said. They didn't, because Sarah's children almost exclusively married each other's children. Dr. Thorne highlighted the connections in red. First cousins, second cousins, third cousins, the towns, isolation, and the Mackenzie family's social dominance created a genetic bottleneck. Instead of dilution, you got concentration. The MKZ 1847 marker didn't fade, it intensified. One of the researchers, a population geneticist named Dr. Howell, shook his head. That should have caused inbreeding depression, increased rates of genetic disorders, stillbirths, infertility. You can't sustain a population this small with this much intermarriage for 5 generations without catastrophic problems. Unless, Dr. Thorne said, the source DNA is robust enough to override the usual risks. Silence. You're saying Sasquatch DNA is hardier than human DNA? Maya asked. I'm saying whatever Sarah was, whatever her non-human parent was, it passed down traits that don't follow human genetic rules. Look at the health records. She pulled up data from Havenwood's volunteer clinic, anonymized but cross-referenced by family groups. Childhood mortality, half the national average. Cancer rates, 30% below state norms. Cardiovascular disease, almost non-existent under age 70. Bone fractures, rare, and when they occurred, healing times were 40% faster than typical. They're not just tall, Dr. Thorne said. They're healthier, stronger, more resistant to disease and injury. The Mackenzie line didn't degrade over generations. It thrived. Dr. Howell leaned forward, squinting at the health data. This is impossible. It's documented. Then we're looking at a non-human hominid species that's more genetically fit than Homo sapiens. He sat back. Do you understand what that means? Dr. Thorne did. It meant Bigfoot, whatever they were, weren't evolutionary dead ends. Relic populations clinging to survival in the margins. They were apex genetics. And when their DNA mixed with humanity's, it didn't corrupt the line. It improved it. The team spent another week combing through historical accounts, looking for anything that might explain Sarah's origin beyond the tribal oral histories and prospectors' journals. They found 3 additional references. A territorial Marshall's report from 1852 mentioned investigating rumors of wild men in the Cabinet Mountains after hunters reported finding enormous footprints and hearing vocalizations that sounded almost human but not quite. The marshal concluded it was likely bears and closed the case. A letter written in 1868 by a Catholic missionary described meeting Sarah Mackenzie and being unsettled by her refusal to discuss her past. She is a woman of great piety, he wrote, but when I asked where she learned to pray, she said only, I remembered. When I asked what she meant, she looked toward the mountains and said, they sing. I did not press further. A memoir published in 1903 by a former Havenwood miner recounted a night in 1859 when Sarah, then in her 40s, heard something in the forest beyond town and walked into the darkness alone. She returned at dawn. She was weeping, the miner wrote, but she wouldn't say why. Someone asked if she'd seen a ghost. She said, no, family. Dr. Thorne read that passage 3 times. She had contact, Maya said. After she came down from the mountains, she still had contact. Maybe. Dr. Thorne highlighted the word family. Or she went looking and didn't find them. Either way, she knew what she was, and I think she knew what her children were. The final piece came from Sarah's death record. She died in December 1891, age estimated at 68, cause listed as natural decline. Her eldest son Thomas was with her. The attending doctor, a man named Philip Grist, added a handwritten note at the bottom of the record. Patient refused last rites. Asked instead to be buried in the forest, not the churchyard. Her son honored the request. I did not ask why. Dr. Thorne pulled up a topographical map and cross-referenced it with Havenwood's land records from 1891. Thomas Mackenzie owned a parcel of timberland 3 miles north of town, adjacent to what was then unsurveyed wilderness. She marked the location. That's where she is, she said quietly. Not in town, not with the other settlers, in the forest. Maya stared at the map. Do you think he knew? I think all of her children knew. Dr. Thorne closed the file. And I think they kept the secret for 160 years. Dr. Thorne didn't sleep the night the genealogy mapped cleanly back to Sarah Mackenzie. She sat in the research trailer with the heater rattling and every family tree printed and pinned to corkboard, all those branches converging on a single point in 1847. 340 people, one woman. The Mackenzie marker existed in 87% of them, undiluted enough to be identical across generations. That shouldn't happen. Genetic drift, mutation, recombination. DNA doesn't stay frozen for 160 years unless it's doing something so essential that natural selection won't let it change. She needed a reference population, something to compare it against. The problem was simple. MKZ-1847 matched nothing in GenBank, nothing in the Human Genome Project archives, nothing in any university database she had access to. It wasn't a known mutation. It wasn't a variant of anything cataloged. It was new, or old, or other. She made the call on a Thursday morning in November to a colleague she hadn't spoken to in 6 years. Dr. Raymond Keller worked for a division of the National Park Service that didn't appear on organizational charts. His job, as far as Thorne understood it, was to investigate wildlife anomalies, animals behaving strangely, population die-offs with no clear cause, ranger reports of things that didn't fit existing taxonomies. He also maintained a database nobody was supposed to know about. I need access to your collection, she told him. Keller was quiet for a long time. Which collection? The one with samples you can't identify. Hair, tissue, blood if you have it. Another pause. Why would I have something like that? Because 30 years ago you published a paper on primate migration patterns in the Pacific Northwest and then never published anything again. Because you still work for the Park Service but nobody knows what you do. And because I just found an entire town of people carrying DNA that shouldn't exist, and I think you might have seen it before. She heard him exhale. You're talking about the cryptid samples. Yes, those aren't... He stopped. I can't just give you access. There are protocols. Raymond, I have 340 living people with an unidentified hominid marker in their genome. If your samples are what I think they are, we can finally prove this thing is real. The silence stretched longer this time. Send me your data, he said, encrypted. I'll run it myself. She sent the Mackenzie marker sequence that afternoon. Keller called her back 6 hours later. His voice sounded strange, hollow. You need to come to Portland, he said. Don't tell anyone where you're going. The archive was in a basement in a federal building that officially housed Bureau of Land Management offices. Keller met her at a side entrance after dark. He'd aged badly, more gray than she remembered, deep lines around his eyes. He walked her through 2 locked doors and a hallway with no windows. The archive room was small, cold, and filled with filing cabinets and freezer units. We've been collecting samples for 40 years, Keller said. hair recovered from encounter sites, tissue from claw marks on trees, blood from an incident in Washington in 1982 that I'm not allowed to discuss. Every time a ranger files a report about something large, bipedal, and unidentified, we send a team. Most of it's bear, elk, hoaxes. He opened one of the freezers, rows of labeled vials, organized by date and location. About 11% of it isn't. He pulled a tablet from his jacket and opened a file. A genome sequence filled the screen. "This is a composite," he said. DNA extracted from 17 different samples collected across 4 states over 26 years. Hair mostly. 2 tissue samples. They all share a core genetic structure, similar enough to be the same species, different enough to be individuals. We've had geneticists look at it. It's hominid. It's not human. It's not any known great ape. He handed her the tablet. "I ran your Mackenzie marker against this." Thorne looked at the screen. The comparison analysis was already open. Genomic match. 40.3%. She stared at the number. Her hands started shaking. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It's a parent-offspring relationship," Keller said. "Or something close to it. Your Sarah Mackenzie, whoever she was, she carried 40% of her genome from whatever species left these samples." Thorne sat down hard on a metal stool. The freezer hummed beside her. 40%. Not a trace amount, like Neanderthal DNA in modern humans. Not 2% or 4% left over from some ancient interbreeding event thousands of years ago. 40%. Recent. Direct. "She was a hybrid," Thorne said. Keller nodded. "First generation. One parent human, one parent this." He gestured at the freezer. "Bigfoot," Thorne said. The word felt absurd in her mouth. Clinical. Insufficient. "We don't call it that in official documentation," Keller said. "The classification is Anthropoides ameriborealis, unconfirmed species. But yes." She pulled up the detailed comparison on the tablet. The Mackenzie marker wasn't scattered fragments. It was coherent clusters, whole chromosomal segments that had come through intact. Genes for bone growth, muscle development, connective tissue, visual processing. "This explains everything," she said quietly. "The height, the strength, the bone density. It's not human variation. It's cryptid traits expressing through human genetics." Keller leaned against the filing cabinet. "We suspected something like this might be possible. There are old reports, 1800s, early 1900s, of women disappearing in the wilderness and coming back changed, or not coming back at all. Native oral histories mention it. We always dismissed it as folklore." "Sarah didn't come back," Thorne said. "She arrived, pregnant and alone." She scrolled through the genome comparison. The match was undeniable. Statistical confidence above 99%. "How is this even biologically possible?" she asked. "Different species can't usually interbreed. And if they do, the offspring are sterile. Mules, ligers. But Sarah's children had children." The line continued. "Lions and tigers diverged about 3 million years ago," Keller said. "Humans and Neanderthals split maybe 600,000 years ago, and we could still interbreed. If this species," he gestured at the freezer again, "if they're closely related enough, if the chromosomal count is compatible, if the reproductive biology lines up." He trailed off. "We don't know enough about them. We don't know anything about them except that they're real. They're rare. And apparently at least one of them had a child with a human being in the 1840s. Thorne thought about Sarah Mackenzie walking out of the Montana wilderness in winter. Pregnant. Alone. "What happened to her?" she asked quietly. "The human mother? Or was Sarah's mother the—" "We don't know," Keller said. "Could be either. Could be Sarah's father was human, and her mother was a Sasquatch. Could be the reverse. The genetic data doesn't tell us that." Thorne looked at the genome again. 40% cryptid, 60% human. A merger, not a mutation. How many people know about this? She asked. About the samples. Maybe 20 across multiple agencies. About your discovery? He shook his head. Right now, just you and me. She closed the tablet. Her mind was racing. This is the most important genetic finding in a century, she said. Proof of a living North American hominid. Proof of viable interbreeding. This changes everything we know about human evolution, speciation, the boundaries between. It also turns 340 people into government property, Keller interrupted. Thorne stopped. If you publish this, he continued, Havenwood becomes a research site. Those people spend the rest of their lives in labs. Their children get taken for study. The military gets involved because of course they will. Imagine what those genetics could be used for. Super soldiers, enhanced operatives. He pulled the tablet from her hands. I've been sitting on this data for 3 decades, he said. You know why? Because the moment we prove this thing exists, we weaponize it. That's what we do. We don't preserve it. We exploit it. Thorne felt the weight settling into her chest. She thought about the people she'd met in Havenwood, the miners, the school teacher, the teenagers who'd volunteered blood samples because they thought it was cool to be part of a science project. They had no idea what they were. What do I do? She asked. Keller handed her a business card. No name, just a phone number. You call this number, he said. You talk to people who make things classified, and you decide if the truth is worth destroying an entire town. Thorne didn't call the number for 3 days. She went back to Havenwood first, walked through the town with new eyes. The custom door frames weren't just accommodation. They were architecture designed for bodies carrying Sasquatch bone structure, larger skulls, broader shoulders, frames built to support mass that human skeletons couldn't handle alone. The logging crews that worked faster and longer than any contractor expected weren't just well-trained. They had muscle fiber composition, optimized for strength and endurance, the same adaptations that would let a 700-pound cryptid move silently through dense forest. The local doctor's notes about unusually low resting heart rates, 42 beats per minute in a 19-year-old, 38 in a woman in her 50s, weren't anomalies. They were superior cardiovascular efficiency, the kind needed to sustain a large body through harsh mountain winters. Even small things she'd noticed and dismissed, the way residents moved quietly despite their size, the sharpness of their night vision, the fact that nobody in town wore glasses despite a population that skewed older. Cryptid traits, all of them. She sat in the diner and watched Marcus Tall Elk, 6 feet 9 inches, 290 pounds, 63 years old, carry a crate of supplies in one hand that should have required 2 people. His grandfather had been one of Sarah Mackenzie's sons. He caught her staring and smiled. Need something, Dr. Thorne? She shook her head. Just thinking. He nodded and kept walking. She thought about what Keller had said. Government property. That night she returned to the research trailer and opened her laptop. She pulled up the genetic analysis and started writing a different kind of report. The science was straightforward once you accepted the premise. Sarah Mackenzie carried approximately 40% Sasquatch DNA. When she had children with human partners, and the historical record suggested all her partners were fully human, her offspring inherited roughly half her genetic material. Half of 40% is 20%. Her 7 children would have been approximately 20% cryptid, 80% human. Still enough for the traits to express strongly. The historical descriptions matched: extraordinary height, incredible strength, robust builds. When those children had their own children with human partners, the percentage dropped again. 10% cryptid, then 5%. then 2.5%. But it didn't disappear. Thorne had traced family lines forward through 5 generations. The Mackenzie marker was still present in 87% of the current population, and while the percentage of total cryptid DNA had diluted, key segments had been preserved. Natural selection had kept them. She documented the specific traits that persisted: skeletal structure. Bone density in Havenwood residents averaged 2.8 times normal human density. Even residents with only 3 to 4% cryptid DNA showed this. Denser bones meant they could support greater height and muscle mass without the skeletal fractures that plagued unusually tall humans elsewhere. Muscle composition. Tissue samples showed a higher ratio of type 2B fast-twitch muscle fibers, the kind responsible for explosive strength and power. This matched what you'd expect in a species that needed to bring down large prey or defend itself against predators. Cardiovascular efficiency. Resting heart rates consistently 20 to 30% below human average, paired with larger lung capacity. Thorne had noticed residents barely winded after climbing steep trails that left her gasping. Visual acuity. Every resident tested showed exceptional night vision. Retinal structure revealed a higher concentration of rod cells, photoreceptors optimized for low-light conditions. One resident mentioned he'd never used a flashlight while hiking at night and thought it was normal. Metabolic regulation. Body temperature averaged half a degree lower than standard human baseline. Combined with efficient fat storage patterns, this suggested adaptation to cold mountain environments. These weren't random quirks. They were functional advantages that had been conserved because they worked. The people of Havenwood weren't just taller. They were stronger, more durable, better adapted to the environment their ancestor had come from. They were successful hybrids. Thorne looked at the data and understood why the scientific community would lose its collective mind. Conventional wisdom said that different species couldn't produce viable offspring. And when they could, horses and donkeys, lions and tigers, the hybrids were sterile, dead ends. But that rule had exceptions. Humans and Neanderthals had interbred successfully. Their children were fertile. The evidence was written in modern DNA. Most people of European and Asian descent carried 1 to 4% Neanderthal genes. Humans and Denisovans, another extinct hominid, had also produced viable offspring. Some populations in Oceania still carried Denisovan DNA. The key was how recently the species had diverged. If the split was recent enough, a few 100,000 years, not millions, the genetics might still be compatible, which meant Sasquatch, whatever it was, had to be closely related to modern humans. A sister species, not an ape, not something alien. Family. Thorne wrote that in her notes and stared at it. The implications were staggering. If Bigfoot could interbreed with humans, it wasn't just an intelligent animal. It was intelligent enough to form relationships, to communicate, even across species lines, to make choices. Sarah Mackenzie hadn't been abducted or attacked. She'd arrived in Havenwood pregnant. Yes, but she'd walked there herself, chosen to leave the wilderness, chosen to raise her children among humans. Why? The records said she never spoke about the father, never explained where she came from, but she'd stayed, built a life, raised 7 children who survived and thrived. She'd integrated. Thorne closed her laptop and looked out the trailer window at the dark forests beyond town. Somewhere out there, Sarah's other family might still exist. Pure Sasquatch, watching from the trees, wondering what happened to the hybrid daughter who disappeared into human settlement 160 years ago. Or maybe they knew. Maybe they'd always known. Maybe the figures residents occasionally reported seeing at the forest edge weren't threats. Maybe they were relatives, checking on the bloodline that stayed behind. Thorne rubbed her eyes. She was anthropomorphizing, projecting human emotions onto a species she'd never seen, whose behavior she couldn't begin to understand. But the genetics didn't lie. 40% of Sarah Mackenzie's genome came from something that could produce viable children with humans. Something close enough to us that the biology worked. Something that had walked upright, used tools. The historical accounts mentioned Sarah's skill with traps and leather work, and made decisions about its future. Not an animal, a person, just not a human one. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Keller had given her. A man answered on the second ring. No greeting, just silence, waiting. "My name is Dr. Eris Thorne," she said. "I was told to call this number regarding classification protocols for sensitive genetic research." "We've been expecting your call, Dr. Thorne," the man said. "We'd like to meet." Dr. Thorne's hands shook as she held the classified report. She had spent 3 months in Havenwood, 3 months collecting blood samples, mapping family trees, running genomic analyses that should have been impossible. And now she held proof, not speculation, not folklore, but peer-reviewed, replicable scientific proof that Bigfoot was real, intelligent enough to interbreed with humans, and genetically compatible with our species. It was the discovery of the century, and she couldn't tell anyone. The University Ethics Board convened an emergency session. Her research team sat in a windowless conference room, while administrators argued in legal terminology about informed consent, vulnerable populations, and institutional liability. Nobody said what they were all thinking. If this goes public, Havenwood dies, not literally. But the town would become a laboratory. Federal agencies would claim jurisdiction. Media would camp at the town limits. Every resident would spend the rest of their lives as a test subject. Their children studied, their blood samples filed in government databases under national security protocols. One of Thorne's graduate students, a molecular biologist who had spent 6 weeks in Havenwood, said it plainly. "We're talking about 340 people who didn't ask to be part of history. They just want to live." But Thorne's department head saw it differently. This was anthropological proof of a sister species. This rewrote human evolution. This answered questions humanity had asked for millennia. How could they justify burying it? The argument lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, 2 men in dark suits arrived from Washington with federal classification orders. The decision was made for them. The Havenwood study was sealed under national security protocols, accessible only to personnel with top-secret clearance. Dr. Thorne's research, every genetic map, every blood sample, every interview recording, disappeared into a vault. She was allowed to keep one thing, the memory of telling the town what they were. The town meeting was held in the old mining hall, the only building with ceilings high enough for the entire population. Dr. Thorne stood at the front and told them the truth. Some residents walked out. Others sat in stunned silence. A few wept. Thorne couldn't tell if from grief or the relief. An older woman, 4th-generation Mackenzie, stood and said, "My grandmother told me we had wild blood. I thought she meant we were stubborn." Nervous laughter rippled through the hall, but the reaction split along generational lines. The older residents wanted the study buried, the results forgotten, their lives returned to normal. They had spent 70 years being quietly different. They didn't want to spend their final decades being publicly strange. The younger ones felt differently. A high school senior, 6'9", varsity basketball, college scouts already circling, said, "I've spent my whole life being asked if I have a pituitary disorder. Now I finally have an answer." He paused. "We're not broken. We're just not entirely human." The phrase spread through town. Children of the forest. Some embraced it. Others hated it. But it stuck. The town's relationship with the surrounding wilderness changed. Hunting trips felt different now, less like harvesting resources, more like walking through ancestral territory. Some residents reported feeling inexplicable pulls toward certain ridgelines or valleys, as though something in their blood recognized the landscape, and only a few, and only spoken about in whispers, claimed to have seen figures watching from the tree line. Tall, silent, too human to be animal, too still to be human. Family, perhaps. Checking on the descendants who stayed. Havenwood still exists. The census records list 340 residents. The average height remains 6 feet 7 inches. And now they know why. Some carry the knowledge like shame, others like a crown. But all of them understand what they are. Proof that the line between human and cryptid was never as clear as we believed. The real question isn't whether Sarah Mackenzie was a hybrid. The DNA settled that. The real question is whether she was the only one. Remote valleys exist. Across the Rockies, the Appalachians, the Pacific Northwest. Small populations, unusual traits, stories dismissed as folklore. If it happened once, it happened again. And if Bigfoot is intelligent enough to interbreed with humans, produce children who survive and thrive, then everything we've assumed about these creatures is wrong. They're not animals. They never were. The residents of Havenwood go about their lives, mining, hunting, raising families. But some of them have started spending time at the forest edge, waiting, watching, looking for figures between the trees. Because now they know the woods aren't empty. They're home.